A commercial airliner plummeted through storm clouds, hydraulics failing, 300 souls on board. Air traffic control went silent. Military jets scrambled but couldn't help. Then one voice crackled through the emergency frequency, a call sign no one had spoken in 15 years. Dark Rider. What happened next didn't just save an aircraft, it exposed a billion-dollar cover-up, humbled a corporate empire, and reminded the world that some legends never die, they just fly different skies. He was a single father, a man who traded supersonic jets for passenger planes, a pilot with nothing left to prove and everything to protect. But when crisis struck at 38,000 feet, the most dangerous airspace in America, needed the one name everyone thought had vanished forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Skyline International Airport, Phoenix, Arizona. The control tower stood like a glass sentinel against the desert sky, its windows reflecting the orange glow of sunset. Inside, the usual symphony of radio chatter and radar pings had been replaced by something far more sinister, silence, punctuated by panic. Flight Director Adeline Scott pressed her headset tighter against her ear, willing the static to resolve into something coherent. Anything coherent. Her fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the emergency protocol manual, though she'd memorized every page years ago. Some situations weren't in the manual. Phoenix Tower. This is Coastal Airways 2847. We have complete hydraulic failure. Repeat, complete hydraulic failure. We are descending through flight level 320 and cannot maintain altitude. The pilot's voice carried the forced calm of a man watching his own execution in slow motion. 312 passengers, 18 crew members. A Boeing 777 that had become little more than a 300-ton glider with the aerodynamics of a refrigerator. Adeline's team moved with practiced precision around her. Screens lit up with flight paths, weather data, emergency protocols. None of it mattered. A 777 without hydraulics couldn't be steered, couldn't deploy flaps, couldn't control anything. It could only fall, slowly and inevitably, toward the unforgiving Arizona desert below. Coastal 2847, Phoenix Tower. Adeline responded, her voice steady despite the ice water flowing through her veins. We're clearing all airspace. Emergency crews are standing by. What's your current fuel status? Approximately 40 minutes remaining. We're trying manual reversion, but the backup systems aren't responding. Tower, we need options. Options. The word hung in the air like a cruel joke. Adeline glanced at her senior controller, Dylan Porter, whose weathered face had gone pale. He'd been in this tower for 23 years. He'd seen bird strikes, engine failures, even a gear-up landing that somehow everyone walked away from. But this was different. Get me every aviation expert within 100 miles, Adeline said, her command voice cutting through the tension. Commercial, military, experimental. I don't care if they're retired or in a nursing home. Get them on the line now. The next 20 minutes became a blur of desperate consultations. Boeing engineers in Seattle talked them through impossible scenarios. Air Force liaisons offered fighter escort, as if watching the crash happen would somehow help. An experimental aircraft designer suggested a technique that required equipment the plane didn't have, and training the pilots hadn't received. Nothing. Every expert, every protocol, every prayer led to the same conclusion. The aircraft was going to crash. The only question was where and how many people on the ground would die with the passengers. Adeline stood up, pacing the small space behind the control stations. Through the tower windows, she could see the ordinary chaos of an airport at dusk. Planes taxiing, luggage carts racing between terminals, passengers boarding flights with no idea that somewhere above them, 300 people were counting down their final minutes. She was about to issue the evacuation order for the projected crash zone when Dylan's voice cut through her thoughts. Adeline. His tone made her turn. There's someone on the military frequency. He's asking about the coastal flight. Who? Dylan's fingers moved across his keyboard, pulling up the transmission data. Call sign Dark Rider. He says he can help. The room went still. Several of the older controllers looked up sharply. Adeline saw something flicker across their faces that she couldn't quite identify. Recognition? Disbelief? Dark Rider? She repeated. That's not an active call sign. Run it through the database. Already did, Dylan said, his voice strange. It's flagged as inactive. Hasn't been used in 15 years. Last registered to a test pilot program that was classified and then shut down. Adeline grabbed the edge of the console. So someone's using a dead call sign to interfere with an emergency situation? Trace it and, Adeline. Dylan turned his screen toward her. 3 F-22 Raptors just diverted from Luke Air Force Base. They're requesting to escort Coastal 2847. And they specifically requested confirmation that Dark Rider is involved. The name hung in the air like smoke from an old fire, something that should have burned out long ago but somehow still smoldered. Adeline had been with the FAA for 12 years, had worked her way up from ground operations to flight director through sheer competence and an inability to accept the word impossible. But she'd never heard of Dark Rider, yet clearly others had. Get him on the line, she said quietly. Now. The radio crackled. When the voice came through, it wasn't the clipped, professional tone of a controller or the tight urgency of a pilot in distress. It was calm, almost conversational, with an undercurrent of something that sounded like absolute certainty. Phoenix Tower, this is Dark Rider. I'm monitoring Coastal 2847 situation. Patch me through to the cockpit. Negative, Dark Rider. Adeline responded, her training overriding her curiosity. This is a closed emergency channel. Identify yourself properly, or clear this frequency. A pause. Then. My name is Ryder Maxwell. I'm currently a captain with Coastal Airways, off duty. I was a test pilot for the Advanced Tactical Aircraft program before it was dissolved. I've flown 73 different aircraft types, including experimental hydraulic failure simulations that nobody thought could be survived. And I've talked 4 pilots through catastrophic systems failures in conditions that made today look like a practice run. Adeline's mouth went dry. Captain Maxwell, even if that's true. It is true. And right now, that aircraft has about 32 minutes of fuel before the engines flame out, and it becomes a brick. When that happens, the pilots will have exactly one chance to put it down. If they're off by 3 degrees, or 2 knots, everyone dies. But there's a technique, one that isn't in any manual, because it was developed for aircraft that don't officially exist. I can walk them through it. Dylan was already pulling up personnel files. He found it quickly, turned the screen. Adeline leaned in and read, Captain Ryder Maxwell, age 42, 15 years, with Coastal Airways. Previously, U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School, Advanced Systems Integration, Project Shadowhawk, classified, decorated, spotless record, and then a gap, a period where he'd simply vanished from military service and reappeared flying passenger routes between Phoenix and Seattle. Why aren't you flying anymore? Adeline asked, though she immediately regretted the question. I mean, why did you leave test flying? Another pause, this one longer. When Maxwell spoke again, his voice carried weight that had nothing to do with aviation. Because I had a daughter who needed a father more than the Air Force. Needed another pilot willing to die for incremental data. I chose her. I'd choose her again. But right now, there are passengers on that plane who have someone waiting for them too. So stop asking questions and let me help them get home. Adeline closed her eyes. Made the decision. Dylan, patch him through to Coastal 2847 and get those F-22 seconds in formation. If Dark Rider says he needs eyes on that aircraft, we give him eyes. As the connections were made and the radio frequencies aligned, Adeline found herself wondering about the man behind the call sign. A legend, apparently, someone the military pilots recognized instantly. Someone who'd walked away from whatever he'd been and chosen ordinary life. Until ordinary life needed him to be extraordinary again. Through her headset, she heard Maxwell's voice connect with the coastal cockpit. Heard the shock, the desperate hope in the pilot's response. And then she heard something else. Confidence beginning to replace panic. Coastal 2847. This is Dark Rider. I need you to trust me. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. But I've done it. I've survived it. And you will too. Adeline stared out at the darkening sky, searching for the distant speck of light that was a dying aircraft and 300 souls holding their breath. Somewhere out there, a single father who flew passengers for a living was about to prove that some legends earned their names for reasons that mattered more than glory. 3 hours earlier, Willow Creek, Arizona, Ryder Maxwell stood in his kitchen, spatula in hand, watching smoke rise from what was supposed to be French toast. The smoke detector screamed its judgment. His daughter, Summer, sat at the table with her math homework spread out like a battle plan, completely unfazed by the culinary disaster unfolding 3 feet away. "Dad, it's literally just eggs, bread, and cinnamon," she said without looking up, her pencil moving across the page with the confidence of someone who'd inherited her mother's precision and her father's stubborn refusal to quit. "I'm aware of the ingredients," Ryder replied, waving a dish towel at the smoke detector until it finally went silent. "I'm attempting to introduce innovation to the process. Innovation is when you improve something. What you're doing is arson." He couldn't help but smile. Summer was 12 now, tall for her age, with dark hair that fell in waves she constantly pushed behind her ears and eyes that seemed to catalog everything. She had her mother's sharp wit and her father's inability to suffer fools. The combination made parent-teacher conferences either very short or very long, with no middle ground. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Cereal. It is," Ryder announced, scraping the pall. "Cereal. Cereal. It is. Charred bread into the trash. Revolutionary." Summer deadpanned. This was their routine. Small house on the edge of Willow Creek, a town 40 minutes from Phoenix that most people drove through without noticing. The house had 3 bedrooms, though only 2 were used. A backyard that was mostly sand and stubborn weeds, and a garage that Ryder had converted into something between a workshop and a shrine to his former life. He didn't talk about that life much. Summer knew the basics. He'd been a military pilot, had done important work, had left when her mom got sick. What she didn't know, what he'd carefully shielded her from, was that important work had meant flying aircraft that officially didn't exist, testing systems that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible, and earning a reputation that made grown men in fighter jets straighten up when they heard his call sign. Dark Rider. The name had come from a night mission gone wrong, when he'd flown a prototype aircraft through a thunderstorm that meteorologists said would tear any plane apart. He'd brought the bird home with 3 systems failures and damage that should have been fatal. The aircraft had looked like it had been through hell, hence Dark Rider, the pilot who flew through darkness and came back. That was 14 years ago. A lifetime ago. Ryder poured cereal, added milk, and set the bowl in front of Summer. She looked up at him with an expression that was pure assessment. "You have your flight face on," she observed. "I don't have a flight face." "Yes, you do. You get this look, like you're calculating something nobody else can see. You've had it since you checked your phone this morning. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes." The text had come from Dylan Porter, an old friend who worked the tower at Skyline International. Just a routine message. "Hey, you flying today? Could use your insight on something if you're around." Ryder wasn't flying today. His schedule was clear until tomorrow afternoon. A Seattle run that was as routine as aviation ever got. But Dylan didn't ask for insight on routine matters. Just thinking about work, Ryder said, which was true enough. Summer nodded, accepting this, and returned to her homework. Ryder watched her for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of choices made and paths not taken. When Elena had been diagnosed, the decision had been simple. Not easy, but simple. His wife had needed him. His daughter had needed him. And experimental test programs didn't accommodate family emergencies or extended leave, so he'd walked away, requested reassignment to commercial aviation, where the flights were predictable, and the most dangerous thing you encountered was turbulence or a drunk passenger. He'd traded classified briefings for passenger manifests, aerial combat simulations for beverage service schedules. Some of his old colleagues thought he'd wasted his talent. A few had said so directly, but they hadn't stood in a hospital room at 3 in the morning, holding their wife's hand, while machines beeped their inadequate reassurances. They hadn't watched a 7-year-old trying to be brave while her whole world crumbled. Ryder had made his choice. He'd make it again. His phone buzzed. Not a text this time, but a call. Dylan. "Give me a second, kiddo," Ryder said, stepping into the living room. "Dylan, what's going on? We have a situation." Dylan's voice had the tight quality of controlled panic. "Coastal 777. Complete hydraulic failure. It's bad, Ryder. It's really bad." Ryder's entire body went still. "Coastal? Which flight?" 2,847. Phoenix to Seattle. They're about 40 minutes from fuel exhaustion, and nobody can figure out how to bring them down. Phoenix to Seattle. The route Ryder flew 3 times a week. The aircraft could easily have been one he'd piloted. The crew were almost certainly people he knew. "What have they tried?" Ryder asked, his mind already running through scenarios, calculating angles and speeds, and impossible physics. Dylan rattled off the list, each option more desperate than the last, each one ending in the same conclusion: unsurvivable impact. "Ryder," Dylan said quietly, "Adeline wants every expert we can find. She's out of options. And I remembered the thing you did with that fighter pilot 5 years ago, the one whose controls froze." Ryder remembered. A chance encounter on a military frequency, a young pilot paralyzed with fear, and a technique Ryder had learned flying aircraft that could barely be controlled under ideal conditions. He'd talked the pilot down, saved his life, then disappeared before anyone could ask too many questions. "That was different," Ryder said. "That was a fighter with partial control. A 770. 7 with no hydraulics is impossible. I know. Everyone knows. Which is why I'm calling you. Because impossible is what you used to do before breakfast." Through the doorway, Ryder could see Summer working on her math, her brow furrowed in concentration. Safe, grounded, the life he'd built for her, for them, and somewhere above the Arizona desert, 300 people were running out of time. "I need you to patch me through," Ryder heard himself say. "Military frequency, if you can. The F-22 seconds from Luke will want confirmation." "Confirmation of what?" "That Dark Rider is back." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Ryder, that call sign has been inactive for 15 years. I know. But those fighter pilots will know it. And if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to ask a commercial crew to trust me with 300 lives, I need them to know I'm not some random voice on the radio. I need them to know I've been where they are and survived." Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll set it up. But Ryder, if this doesn't work, if it doesn't work, they die anyway. At least this way they have a chance." Ryder ended the call and stood in his living room, in his ordinary house, in his ordinary town, feeling the weight of who he used to be settling back onto his shoulders like a flight suit he'd hung up but never quite forgotten how to wear. "Dad?" He turned. Summer was standing in the doorway, homework forgotten. "You're going to help someone, aren't you? No point in lying." She'd see through it immediately. "Yes. Someone in trouble." Yes. She studied him with those two old eyes. Eyes that had learned about loss earlier than any person should. Then she nodded once, a gesture of permission and understanding that made Ryder's throat tight. Then go, Summer said simply. Do what you do. Ryder grabbed his keys and his leather flight jacket. The one with the patches removed, but the worn spots where they'd been still visible. As he headed for the door, Summer called out one more time. Dad, bring them home. I will, he promised. And meant it. Skyline International Airport, Emergency Operations Center. Adeline Scott had built her career on preparation. Every scenario mapped, every contingency planned, every possible crisis met with protocols developed over decades of aviation, safety, evolution. But preparation only worked when the crisis fit inside the boundaries of possibility. Coastal Airways 2847 had left those boundaries behind 30,000 feet ago. She stood at the center of the operations floor, surrounded by screens showing data that all told the same story. An aircraft falling from the sky with no way to control it. Her team moved with urgent efficiency. But she could see the edges of panic creeping in. The tight voices, the repeated checks of information they'd already verified. The glances toward her that asked the question nobody wanted to voice. What do we do when there's nothing we can do? Tower, this is Raptor 1. We have visual on Coastal 2847. The voice belonged to Major Hunter Tate, leading a 3-ship formation of F-22 seconds that had diverted from Luke Air Force Base. They'd arrived in minutes. Flying formation around the dying commercial jet like honor guards at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Raptor 1. Phoenix Tower, Adeline responded. What's your assessment? A pause. Then, aircraft appears intact. No visible damage to control surfaces, but she's descending at approximately 1,200 feet per minute, and the angle is increasing. Tower, they're running out of sky. Adeline closed her eyes briefly. 1,200 feet per minute. At their current altitude, that gave them perhaps 25 minutes before impact. 25 minutes to solve a problem that the best aviation minds had already declared unsolvable. Director Scott. Dylan appeared at her elbow, his expression strange. Hopeful. And terrified in equal measure. Dark Rider is on frequency. He's ready to attempt contact with the cockpit. This better work, Dylan. Because if we're pinning 300 lives on some retired pilot's memory of classified programs. It's not just memory, Dylan interrupted, which was unusual enough that Adeline stopped. Ryder Maxwell didn't just fly experimental aircraft. He survived them. There's a reason the F-22 pilots recognized his call sign immediately. He's a legend in certain circles. The kind of legend that makes people sit up and pay attention. Adeline wanted to believe that. Wanted to trust that somewhere in Maxwell's past was the key to saving this flight. But wanting something and having it were different things. And right now she was responsible for making decisions based on reality, not hope. Patch him through, she said. But I'm monitoring every word. If this goes sideways. If it goes sideways, we're already there. Dylan said quietly. The radio crackled. Coastal 2847. This is Dark Rider. On military frequency. Do you copy? A long silence. Then a voice Adeline didn't recognize, tight with stress. Dark Rider, this is Coastal 2847. Captain Landon Pierce. I copy, but I don't recognize your call sign. Please identify. Captain Pierce. My name is Ryder Maxwell. I'm a coastal captain, currently off duty. I'm also a former test pilot who specialized in catastrophic systems failures. I've flown hydraulic failure scenarios in conditions similar to yours. I can help you bring that aircraft down. Another pause. Adeline could imagine the conversation happening in that cockpit. The desperate hope warring with skepticism, The weight of responsibility for 300 lives pressing down on every decision. Maxwell, we've tried everything. Boeing engineers have walked us through every procedure. We have zero control authority. Zero. We can't steer, can't deploy flaps, can't do anything but watch ourselves fall. I know, Ryder's voice came back, calm as still water. I know exactly what you're facing. But there's a technique that wasn't developed for commercial aircraft. It was developed for experimental platforms that lost hydraulics during high-stress testing. It's not in your manual because officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficial techniques are how people die. Pierce responded. But Adeline heard the thread of desperation underneath the pushback. Captain Pierce, Ryder said, his tone shifting to something firmer. People die when we accept the impossible instead of challenging it. You have approximately 23 minutes of fuel remaining. When those engines flame out, you lose the last bit of control you have. So you have two choices. Accept that this aircraft is going to crash, or trust me when I tell you there's another way. Adeline found herself holding her breath. This was the moment. The point where crisis either found resolution or collapsed into tragedy. Raptor 1, this is Coastal 2847. Pierce's voice had changed, decision made. Do you know Dark Ryder? Major Tate's response was immediate. Affirmative, Coastal. Dark Ryder is verified, he's legitimate. If he says he can get you down, I'd bet my wings on it. Coming from an F-22 pilot, that wasn't just an endorsement. It was a declaration of faith. All right, Dark Ryder, Pierce said, and Adeline heard the shift, the mental transition from resigned victim to active participant. We're listening. What do you need? First, I need you to trust your instruments less and your instincts more. The aircraft is going to feel wrong. It's supposed to. Second, I need your first officer's name. Edith Walsh. Captain Pierce and First Officer Walsh. Here's what we're going to do. The technique relies on asymmetric thrust and gravity-assisted control. We're going to use your engines not for power, but for steering. It's going to be gentle, almost imperceptible adjustments. Too much and you'll spin. Too little and you won't turn. It requires feel, not calculation. Dark Ryder, we're descending at 1,200 feet per minute. We don't have room for trial and error. You're not going to trial and error this, Captain. You're going to do exactly what I tell you. Exactly when I tell you. And before we start, I need you to understand something. What's that? Ryder's voice softened, became almost conversational. I have a daughter. She's 12. When I left for work this morning, she reminded me to pick up milk on the way home. That's the kind of ordinary day I'm trying to get back to. You have passengers on that aircraft with the same kind of ordinary days waiting for them. Someone's planning dinner. Someone's worried they'll miss their connection. Someone's counting down the minutes until they can hug their family. He paused. We're going to give them those moments back. All of them, because the alternative is unacceptable. In the operations center, the room had gone completely silent. Everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen. Adeline felt something shift in her chest, some cold knot of fear loosening just slightly. This wasn't just some pilot with forgotten techniques. This was someone who understood what was at stake in terms that had nothing to do with aviation and everything to do with being human. All right, Dark Ryder, Captain Pierce said, and this time his voice carried something it hadn't before. Hope. Tell us what to do. First, I need you to reduce thrust on Engine 3 by exactly 7%. 7%? That's incredibly specific. It is, and it's the difference between controlled descent and an uncontrolled spin. Trust me, Captain. 7% on Engine 3. Adeline watched her screens as the data began to change. The descent rate remained steady, but something else shifted. Some quality in the aircraft's attitude that the instruments couldn't quite capture, but she could sense. Dark Ryder, we're showing a slight yaw to the left. Correct. That's what we want. Now, Engine 1, reduce by 3%. Gently. This is where feel matters more than numbers. The minutes ticked past. Ryder's voice remained steady, calling adjustments in percentages and fractions that seemed impossibly precise. The coastal pilots responded with the kind of focused calm that came from having a lifeline to grab onto, however thin. Raptor 1, what's your assessment? Adeline asked quietly. Tower, I've seen some incredible flying in my career. Major Tate responded. This is something else. Dark Rider is literally steering a 777 with nothing but throttle adjustments. It shouldn't be possible. But it's working? It's working. They've reduced descent rate to 900 feet per minute, and they're tracking toward a stable approach path. I don't know how, but it's working. Adeline let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But they weren't down yet. They had fuel for maybe 15 more minutes. And the most dangerous part was still ahead. The actual landing. With no flaps. No control surfaces. Nothing but engine thrust to guide 300 tons of aircraft onto a pleasant. A runway at speeds that would leave zero margin for error. Dark Rider, she said, breaking protocol to speak directly on the channel. This is Phoenix Tower. Flight Director Scott. What do you need from us? Director Scott, I need runway 26 cleared for emergency landing. I need every emergency vehicle you have standing by. And I need every commercial pilot in your terminal with heavy aircraft experience ready to observe. Because if this works, they're going to want to know how. And if it doesn't work? Pause. Then nobody needs to know anything. But it's going to work, Director. Because I promised someone I'd bring them home. Adeline thought about the protocols she was breaking, the procedures she was abandoning, the faith she was placing in a voice on the radio, and a legend she'd never heard of until 20 minutes ago. Then she made her decision. All units, this is Tower. We're committing to Dark Rider's approach. Clear runway, 26. Full emergency response, and somebody, get me a direct line to Coastal Airways Management. They're going to want to know that one of their captains is about to do the impossible. Dylan looked at her, eyebrows raised. You're sure about this? Adeline watched the screens, watched the impossible happening in real time as an aircraft with no controls began to stabilize, began to turn, began to transform from falling object into something that might, possibly, be saved. No, she admitted. But sometimes, the right decision, and the sure decision, aren't the same thing. And right now, that man out there is the only hope 300 people have. So we're going to trust him. She turned back to the radio. Dark Rider, Phoenix Tower. You have clearance for emergency approach, runway 26. The sky is yours. Bring them home. Copy that, Tower. We're coming home. Coastal Airways Flight 2847, 18,000 feet, and descending. Captain Landon Pierce had flown for 22 years. He'd navigated typhoons over the Pacific, landed with one engine out in Denver, and once brought an aircraft down safely after a bird strike shattered his windscreen. He considered himself unflappable, the kind of pilot who turned emergencies into anecdotes. This was different. His hands rested on the throttle controls, making microscopic adjustments based on instructions from a voice he'd never heard before today. Instructions that defied every procedure he'd ever learned, every simulation he'd ever flown, every instinct that screamed this was impossible. Engine 2, increase by 2.3%. Ryder's voice came through, steady as a metronome. Hold for 4 seconds, then back to neutral. 2.3, Pierce repeated, his fingers moving with surgical precision. Holding. Beside him, First Officer Edith Walsh monitored the instruments with the intensity of someone watching a patient's vital signs during surgery. Her face was pale but composed, her voice calm when she reported. Descent rate now 800 feet per minute. Attitude, stable. Dark Rider, we're tracking. Good. Rider responded. Captain Pierce, I need you to stop thinking like a pilot for a moment. Pierce blinked. Excuse me. You're fighting the aircraft. I can hear it in how you're breathing, how quickly you're responding. You're trying to control it the way you've controlled every other plane you've flown. But this isn't about control. It's about conversation. In the passenger cabin behind them, 300 people sat in the eerie quiet that comes when everyone knows something is wrong, but nobody knows exactly what. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced calm, checking seatbelts, offering reassurances that felt hollow, even as they were spoken. In seat 23C, a woman named Kiana Ford clutched her phone, staring at a photo of her two young ones waiting for her in Seattle. She'd been at a conference in Phoenix, 3 days of meetings that had felt endless. Now she'd give anything for just one more boring presentation, if it meant seeing her family again. She didn't know that the man trying to save her life was also thinking about family, about a 12-year-old doing homework at a kitchen table, about promises made and kept. Conversation, Pierce repeated, forcing himself to focus. I don't understand. The aircraft is trying to tell you what it needs, Ryder explained. You're pushing inputs based on what you think should happen. Instead, listen to what is happening. Feel the resistance. Feel when the aircraft wants to yaw or roll. Don't fight it. Guide it. There's a difference. Walsh shot Pierce a look that said this sounds insane. But Pierce was already adjusting his approach. He closed his eyes for just a moment, hands still on the controls, and instead of forcing corrections, he waited. Felt the subtle feedback through the throttles, the way the aircraft responded to each tiny change. I feel it, he said quietly. There's a lag, maybe half a second, then the response builds. Exactly, Ryder said, and Pierce could hear the approval in his voice. That's the harmonic delay in the system. Commercial jets aren't designed for this kind of control input, so the response curve is nonlinear. You have to anticipate it, lead it by that half second. Behind Pierce, the cockpit door opened slightly. The lead flight attendant, Lila Curtis, stuck her head in. Captain, passengers are getting concerned. Should I make an announcement? Pierce glanced at Walsh, who gave a tiny shrug. That meant your call, not mine. He thought about what to say, how to be honest without causing panic. Tell them, Pierce began, then paused. Tell them we're experiencing a technical issue that requires careful navigation. Tell them we have expert guidance and we're on approach to Phoenix. Tell them to trust us. Lila nodded and withdrew. Through the door, Pierce could hear her voice over the PA system, delivering the message with the kind of confidence that came from working with this crew. For years, she trusted them. Everyone on this aircraft trusted them. That weight sat heavy on Pierce's shoulders. Dark Ryder. Walsh spoke up, her eyes on the fuel gauge. We have 11 minutes of fuel remaining. Is that enough? It's enough, if we commit to the approach now. Ryder replied. No second chances, no go-arounds. We put it down on the first attempt, or we're walking home. Pierce felt his stomach tighten. In normal operations, having fuel for a single approach attempt was standard. But nothing about this was standard. They'd be coming in fast, too fast for comfort, with no ability to abort if something went wrong. Raptor 1, Dark Ryder. Ryder's voice shifted to the military frequency. Major Tate, I need your eyes on the final approach. Call out any drift or angle deviation. Coastal's instruments are reliable, but I need confirmation from outside the aircraft. Copy that, Dark Ryder. Tate responded. We're with you all the way down. The F-22 seconds adjusted their formation, positioning themselves to provide maximum visibility of the commercial jet's approach. It was an unusual sight, fighter jets escorting a passenger plane, but then again, nothing about today was usual. Coastal 2847. This is Phoenix Tower. Adeline Scott's voice cut in. Runway is clear. Emergency services are in position. Wind is light and variable at 4 knots. You are cleared for emergency landing. Runway 26. Tower. Coastal 2847. Pierce acknowledged. Beginning final approach. But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept in. He was about to attempt something that had never been done with a commercial aircraft this size. The technique Ryder described existed only in classified test programs, proven on experimental aircraft, built to survive the unsurvivable. A 777 was different, heavier, less responsive, designed for stability, not the kind of knife-edge maneuvering this approach demanded. Dark Rider, Pierce said quietly. I have to ask, have you ever actually landed an aircraft this size using this technique? A pause, then, no. Walsh's head snapped up. Pierce felt his throat go dry. I've landed fighters, Ryder continued, his voice maddeningly calm. I've landed experimental platforms. I've talked pilots through hydraulic failures in aircraft, ranging from single-engine props to heavy cargo transports. But a 777? No, this is new territory. Then how do you know this will work? Walsh demanded, her composure finally cracking just slightly. Because the physics don't care about aircraft size, Ryder replied. The principles are the same. Thrust vectoring, weight distribution, momentum management. What changes is the scale and the timing. But I've studied 777 performance data for 15 years. I know this aircraft. I know its limits. And more importantly, I know what it can do when pushed beyond what Boeing thought possible. Pierce made a decision. Not based on logic, or procedure, or anything he'd learned in flight school, based on something simpler, the absolute certainty in Ryder Maxwell's voice. The voice of someone who'd been exactly where Pierce was now, and survived. All right, Dark Rider, Pierce said. We're committed. Talk us down. Engine 3, reduced to 72%. Engine 1, increase to 86%. Hold those settings. Pierce's hands moved. The aircraft responded, beginning a gentle bank toward the runway alignment. Through the windscreen, he could see Phoenix spread out below, a carpet of lights in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down there was the runway, a strip of concrete that suddenly seemed impossibly narrow. Descent rate now 1,000 feet per minute. Walsh called out. That's too fast. We're going to overshoot the threshold. No, we're not, Ryder said. Trust the numbers. At 3,000 feet, Engine 2 increases to 90%. That'll slow us without losing the glide path. The numbers. Pierce focused on the numbers, on the tiny adjustments, on the feel of the aircraft responding to inputs it was never designed to receive. Sweat ran down his back, despite the cool cockpit air. 2,000 feet, Walsh announced. Raptor 1, confirm alignment. Ryder requested. Dark Rider, you're slightly left of center line. Recommend right correction of 0.5 degrees. Coastal, Engine 4, increase by 1.2%. 3-second burst, then neutral. Pierce made the adjustment. The aircraft shuddered slightly, then steadied. Through the windscreen, the runway lights became visible. Twin lines of white and red stretching into the distance. 1,000 feet. We're hot. Speed 210 knots. Expected, Ryder said. At 500 feet, all engines to 65% simultaneously. That's your flare, your only flare. The timing has to be exact. Pierce's hands hovered over the throttles. His entire career had led to this moment. Every hour of training, every flight, every decision. But none of it had prepared him for landing a crippled aircraft using nothing but engine thrust and the calm instructions of a man he'd never met. 500 feet, Walsh called, her voice tight. Pierce's hands moved. All 4 throttles pulled back in one smooth motion. The aircraft's nose came up slightly, responding to the reduced thrust. The descent rate slowed, but not enough. They were still coming down too fast. Hold it, Ryder commanded. Don't chase it. Let the momentum bleed off. 300 feet. 200. The runway rushed up to meet them. Emergency vehicles lined the taxiways, their lights painting the scene in red and blue. Pierce could see personnel standing at attention, watching history unfold. 100 feet. Engines to idle, Ryder said. Now. The throttles came back. For one terrible moment, the aircraft hung in the air, suspended between flight and catastrophe. Then the main gear kissed the runway with a chirp of rubber on concrete that was the most beautiful sound Pierce had ever heard. The nose gear came down. The aircraft rolled, speed bleeding off, still traveling fast but on the ground, gloriously on the ground. Coastal 2847, you are down. Adeline Scott's voice came through, thick with emotion. Emergency vehicles are moving to escort. Inside the cabin, silence gave way to something Pierce had never heard before. 300 people erupting in simultaneous cheers, tears, and applause. The sound rolled through the aircraft like a wave. Walsh looked at Pierce, her face wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. We did it. No, Pierce said quietly, his hands still shaking on the controls. He did it. Dark Rider did it. The radio crackled one last time. Coastal 2847, this is Dark Rider. Welcome home. Now, if you'll excuse me, I promised my daughter I'd pick up milk. And just like that, the voice that had saved 300 lives disconnected, leaving Pierce to wonder who exactly Ryder Maxwell was and why someone with that kind of skill was flying passenger routes instead of still saving lives from the cockpit of something experimental and extraordinary. 14 years earlier. Gila Bend Air Force. Auxiliary Field, Arizona. The desert night was cold in the way that deserts are. Heat vanishing the moment the sun dropped below the horizon, leaving behind air so crisp it felt like it could shatter. Lieutenant Ryder Maxwell stood beside an aircraft that didn't officially exist, running his hands along panels that would never appear in any public record. The aircraft designation was XF-47 Wraith, an experimental platform designed to test next-generation flight control systems. It looked like someone had taken a fighter jet and stripped away everything conventional, leaving behind something that seemed more like a sketch of an idea than an actual aircraft. You know this thing has a 73% failure rate, a voice said behind him. Ryder turned to find Major Cole Palmer approaching, clipboard in hand and skepticism written across his face. Palmer was the test program director, a man who'd flown more experimental aircraft than most pilots had logged total hours. I know, Ryder replied. I also know that every failure taught us something new about hydraulic redundancy and control authority. What it taught us is that this bird doesn't want to fly, Palmer said flatly. 3 test pilots have refused to take it up again. The program's being shut down next month. This is your last chance to prove the concept or walk away. Ryder looked back at the Wraith. In the hangar lights, it looked predatory, dangerous, beautiful. I'll fly her, he said simply. Palmer studied him for a long moment. You have a family now, don't you? I heard you got married last year. Elena. She's a structural engineer at Boeing. And you're about to climb into an aircraft that's more likely to kill you than complete a successful test flight. Does she know? Ryder thought about Elena, about the conversation they'd had over breakfast that morning, about how she'd looked at him with those dark eyes that saw through every wall he tried to build and said simply, "Come home. Whatever happens up there, just come home." She knows, Ryder said. She also knows this is what I do, who I am. The test flight launched at 0400 hours, pre-dawn darkness providing cover for an aircraft that wasn't supposed to exist. Ryder climbed to 30,000 feet, began running through the test protocols, control inputs, response delays, system integration checks, everything nominal. Then, at minute 47 of the flight, the primary hydraulic system failed. Warning lights flooded the cockpit. The stick went dead in his hand. Backup systems kicked in automatically. Then those failed too. Within seconds, the Wraith transformed from cutting-edge technology into a brick with wings, falling through the sky at terminal velocity. Gila Tower, this is Wraith 1, Ryder transmitted, his voice calm despite the screaming alarms. I have complete hydraulic failure. All control surfaces unresponsive. Wraith 1. Gila Tower. Palmer's voice came back, tight with controlled panic. Eject. Repeat. Eject immediately. Ryder's hand moved toward the ejection handle. Standard procedure. When controls fail, you don't ride the aircraft down. You punch out, let the multi-million-dollar prototype become a crater, and live to fly. Another day. His hand stopped, because in that moment, falling through darkness with alarms screaming and death approaching at terminal velocity, Ryder heard something. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration. The Wraith's engines were still running, still producing thrust, and thrust meant possibility. Negative on ejection. Tower. Ryder said, "I'm going to try something." "Maxwell, that's not a suggestion. It's an order. Eject now." But Ryder wasn't listening anymore. He was feeling. His right hand moved to the throttle controls, began making tiny adjustments. Left engine back 3%, right engine forward 2%. The aircraft responded, sluggishly, reluctantly, but it responded. A slight yaw to the right. "Tower, I have asymmetric thrust control," Ryder reported, his mind racing through calculations. "I can steer this bird. I'm going to bring her home." What followed was 37 minutes of the most precise flying of Ryder's life. Using nothing but throttle adjustments and the Wraith's natural aerodynamic properties, he guided the dying aircraft back toward Gila Bend. Every input had to be perfect. Too much, and the aircraft would spin into an unrecoverable tumble. Too little, and he'd miss the runway. He made the approach in darkness, guided only by instruments and intuition. When the wheels touched down, barely controlled, the aircraft rolled for 3,000 feet before Ryder managed to bring it to a stop using nothing but differential engine thrust. The canopy opened. Ryder climbed out on legs that shook so badly he could barely stand. Ground crew rushed forward, staring at him like he'd returned from the dead. Major Palmer arrived moments later, his face pale. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, or the most reckless." "It was necessary," Ryder replied. "And now we know it's possible. We know that hydraulic failure doesn't have to mean ejection. It means adaptation." Palmer shook his head slowly. "The program's still shutting down, Maxwell. But what you just did is going to change how we train pilots for catastrophic failures. You just rewrote the book on what's survivable." They gave him a commendation, called him Dark Ryder after that flight. The pilot who rode through impossible darkness and came back. The legend began that night, in a desert testing facility where a young lieutenant proved that death wasn't inevitable, just optional, if you knew how to listen. But legends have costs. 3 years later, Ryder was flying more experimental platforms, pushing boundaries, testing limits. He'd become the pilot they called when something was too dangerous for anyone else. The one who volunteered for flights other test pilots refused. Elena supported him through all of it, even as her worry grew, even as their daughter Summer was born and Ryder would miss weeks at a time. Deployed to classified locations for classified tests, he'd come home exhausted, sometimes injured, always carrying the weight of whatever he'd just survived. "You're going to push too far one day," Elena told him after one particularly close call that left him with cracked ribs and a concussion. "You're going to find the limit of what's survivable." "I'll be careful," he promised. "That's not what I mean," she said, placing a hand on his chest, over his heart. "I mean there's a limit to how many times you can dance with death before it decides to dance back. And when that day comes, Summer and I won't be able to follow where you go." He'd held her then, promised he'd always come home, promised that nothing was more important than them. The universe has a way of testing promises. Elena collapsed during a routine morning in their kitchen. One moment she was pouring coffee, the next she was on the floor, unconscious. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The doctors worked with desperate efficiency, but the blood clot had already done its damage. She died on a Tuesday, while Ryder was 3,000 miles away, preparing for a test flight he'd never complete. By the time he got the call, by the time he made it to the hospital, she was already gone. Summer was 7 years old enough to understand that Mommy wasn't coming home. Not old enough to understand why. Ryder stood in the hospital corridor, still wearing his flight suit, and felt something inside him break in a way that no aircraft ever had. Elena had worried about him dying in some experimental crash, some test gone wrong. Instead, she'd been taken by something mundane, unspectacular, unstoppable. The Air Force offered condolences, offered time off, offered counseling. What they didn't offer was a way to be both the pilot Dark Rider and the father Summer needed. So Ryder made a choice. He walked away from the experimental programs, from the classified briefings, from the aircraft that pushed boundaries of what was possible. He requested transfer to commercial aviation, where flights were scheduled, where he'd be home every night, where the most dangerous thing he'd face would be weather delays. His colleagues thought he was wasting his talent. His commanders tried to change his mind, but Ryder had already made peace with his decision. "I've spent years proving what's survivable," he told Major Palmer during his exit interview. "Now I need to prove I can just survive." For her, Palmer understood. He signed the papers without argument. Ryder moved to Willow Creek with Summer, bought a small house, took a position with Coastal Airways flying passenger routes. He helped with homework, attended school events, learned to cook meals that didn't come from the officers' mess. He became ordinary, except on nights when he'd stand in his garage, looking at old photographs, old patches, old memories of when he'd been someone different. On those nights, Summer would find him there, would take his hand without saying anything, and lead him back inside where ordinary life waited. "Do you miss it?" she asked him once, when she was 10 and starting to understand what he'd given up. Ryder thought about experimental aircraft and impossible flights, and the razor's edge between triumph and disaster. Then he looked at his daughter, healthy and whole, and here. "Not even a little bit," he said, and meant it. Until a voice on the radio asked for help. Until 300 lives needed what only he could give. Until the universe reminded him that some skills, once learned, never quite leave you alone. Phoenix Metropolitan Aviation Safety Board. 3 days after the landing, Adeline Scott sat in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and stale coffee, facing 5 board members whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. On the table between them lay 3 inches of documentation related to Coastal Airways, Flight 2847, every detail of the hydraulic failure, the emergency landing, and the unconventional technique that had saved 300 lives. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," Board Chairman Anthony White said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in aviation oversight. "You authorized an off-duty pilot, one with no current certification in emergency protocols, to direct the cockpit crew of a catastrophically damaged aircraft using techniques that appear nowhere in any approved manual." "That's correct," Adeline replied evenly. "And you did this without consulting Boeing engineering, without approval from the airline's operations center, without following any of the established protocols for in-flight emergencies." "Also correct." White leaned back, exchanged glances with his fellow board members. "Director Scott, you do realize that what you're describing is not heroism. It's a catastrophic breach of protocol that could have resulted in the deaths of everyone on that aircraft." "Could have," Adeline said quietly. "But didn't, because sometimes protocol is a map, and sometimes it's a cage. On that day, we needed someone who knew how to fly without the map." Board member Madeline Brooks, a former airline CEO, leaned forward. "The question before this board isn't whether the landing was successful. Clearly it was. The question is whether that success justifies the abandonment of every safety standard we've built over decades of aviation evolution." "With respect," Adeline replied, "our safety standards assumed that hydraulic failure meant ejection or crash. Those standards didn't account for someone like Ryder Maxwell existing. They didn't account for techniques developed in classified programs that most of us don't have clearance to know about." "Classified programs," White repeated, his tone making clear what he thought of that justification. "So we're simply supposed to trust that this Dark Rider character knew what he was doing based on secret testing that can't be verified." The 300 passengers who walked away from that aircraft verified it. Adeline shot back, her patience finally fraying. The cockpit voice recording verified it. The F-22 pilots who witnessed it verified it. At what point does successful outcome trump procedural purity? Before White could respond, the conference room door opened. A woman in a severe business suit entered, followed by two men carrying briefcases that practically screamed legal department. "My apologies for the interruption," the woman said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "I'm Scylla Harmon, General Counsel for Coastal Airways. These gentlemen represent Boeing Corporation and the Aircraft Manufacturers Insurance Consortium." Adeline felt her stomach drop. This had just stopped being an inquiry and become something much more dangerous. Harmon took a seat at the table uninvited. "We've been reviewing the incident data, and several concerning elements have emerged. Elements that go beyond procedural questions and into the realm of potential liability." "What kind of liability?" White asked, suddenly looking less confident. One of the Boeing representatives, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, opened his briefcase and withdrew a tablet. "Our engineering analysis of the hydraulic failure shows something unusual. The system didn't fail catastrophically, as would be expected from mechanical stress or material fatigue. It failed systematically, as if multiple redundant components gave out simultaneously." Adeline leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," the man continued, "that the failure pattern is consistent with either extraordinarily bad luck or deliberate sabotage. And given the statistical improbability of the former, we're forced to consider the latter." The room went silent. "That's impossible," Adeline said. "Coastal's maintenance records are impeccable. The aircraft underwent full inspection 2 weeks before the flight." "We're aware," Harmon interjected smoothly, "which is why we've expanded our investigation beyond just this incident. In the past 18 months, Coastal Airways has experienced 7 unusual mechanical issues across its fleet. None catastrophic, all resolved, but the pattern is troubling." Board member Seth Newman, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "Are you suggesting someone is deliberately targeting Coastal's aircraft?" "We're suggesting," Harmon said carefully, "that there may be quality control issues in the maintenance supply chain that haven't been properly disclosed, counterfeit parts, substandard components, documentation irregularities, the kind of systemic problems that would make certain parties very interested in ensuring scrutiny remains minimal." Adeline's mind raced. This hearing wasn't called to examine my decisions. It was called to shift attention away from something bigger. White's face flushed. "Director Scott, I assure you this board operates independently." "With respect, Chairman White, I don't believe that anymore." Adeline interrupted. "Someone wants the focus on whether I broke protocol, not on why that protocol was necessary in the first place, not on why a brand new aircraft lost all hydraulics, not on what Flight 2847's failure might reveal about other aircraft still in the air." Harmon's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "Calculation, perhaps, or reassessment. If you're accusing this board of this impropriety," White began, "I'm accusing someone of caring more about liability exposure than about preventing the next failure," Adeline said, her voice rising. "And I'm stating for the record that Ryder Maxwell saved 300 lives using skills that revealed a gap in our safety protocols big enough to fly a 777 through. Instead of attacking him or me, maybe we should be asking why those skills were necessary and what else we're missing." The Boeing representative cleared his throat. "Director Scott raises valid points. However, our concern is that publicizing the technique used in the landing could encourage untrained pilots to attempt similar maneuvers in situations where they're inappropriate. The risk of copycat incidents is less than the risk of pilots not knowing this is possible." Adeline interrupted. "You want to bury this because it's inconvenient, because it raises questions about aircraft design and maintenance protocols and supply chain integrity. But those Questions don't go away just because you intimidate a safety board into silence. Harmon stood slowly. This meeting is clearly becoming unproductive. We'll be filing formal recommendations with the FAA regarding Director Scott's fitness for duty and pursuing alternative venues for addressing these matters. She gestured to her companions, and they began gathering their materials. As they moved toward the door, Adeline called out, "Miss Harmon, one more question." The lawyer paused. "When you bury this investigation, when you shift blame and threaten careers and make the whole incident disappear into legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements, what are you going to tell the passengers on the next flight that goes down? The one that could have been saved if pilots knew what Ryder Maxwell knows. What are you going to tell their families?" Harmon's face remained expressionless. "I'm going to tell them that aviation safety requires complex balancing of risk, liability, and public confidence. And sometimes, Director Scott, the greater good requires difficult choices." She left without waiting for a response. The board members sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, White spoke, his voice tired. "Director Scott, you're suspended pending further review. You'll surrender your credentials and security access immediately." Adeline stood, removed her ID badge, and placed it on the table with deliberate care. "Chairman White, I've dedicated my career to keeping people safe. If that career ends because I chose lives over procedures, I can live with that. Can you?" She walked out without looking back. In the parking garage, Adeline sat in her car for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dylan Porter, "They're coming after you hard. What do you need?" She stared at the message, then typed a reply. "I need Ryder Maxwell. And I need to know who's really behind this before they bury us both." Because Flight 2847 hadn't been saved just to become a cautionary tale about breaking rules. It had been saved because someone remembered that rules serve people, not the other way around. And if powerful interests wanted that lesson forgotten, Adeline was going to make damn sure it was learned instead. Even if it cost her everything. Federal Aviation Administration Headquarters, Washington, D.C. 2 weeks later, the hearing room was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, rows of seats filled with reporters, aviation executives, and government officials. At the center sat a panel of 7 FAA administrators, their faces carefully neutral as they reviewed the case that had consumed aviation circles for the past 14 days. Ryder Maxwell sat at the witness table, wearing a suit that felt foreign after years of flight uniforms and casual clothes. Beside him sat Adeline Scott, her own career hanging in balance. They'd both been subpoenaed to explain their actions on the day Flight 2847 nearly became a statistic. Administrator Parker Drake gavelled the session to order. "This hearing will examine the events of November 12th, specifically the decision-making process that led to unauthorized individuals providing flight instruction during a declared emergency. Captain Maxwell, you're under oath. Please state your qualifications." Ryder leaned toward the microphone. "I'm a commercial airline captain with 15 years at Coastal Airways. Prior to that, I was a test pilot in the Air Force, specializing in experimental aircraft and catastrophic systems failures. And on the day in question, you were off duty, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Yet you inserted yourself into an emergency situation, providing instruction to pilots in a damaged aircraft using techniques that appear in no approved training manual. Can you explain that decision?" Ryder took a breath. "I heard a call for help. I had specific knowledge that could prevent a crash. The decision seemed straightforward." Drake's expression hardened. "Captain, aviation safety depends on standardized procedures. What you did was reckless. You gambled with 300 lives based on classified techniques that can't be verified or replicated. With respect, Administrator, those 300 people are alive because someone was willing to think beyond the procedures that had already failed them." A murmur ran through the gallery. Drake gavelled for silence. Scylla Harmon, representing Coastal Airways, and several other corporate interests, stood. Captain Maxwell, isn't it true that your technique could have resulted in an uncontrolled spin? That you essentially asked trained pilots to ignore their instruments and trust your voice? I asked them to expand their understanding of what was possible. Ryder replied calmly, and yes, there were risks. But the alternative was certain death. I'll take possible over certain every time. How convenient, Harmon said smoothly, that you get to be the hero while my clients face potential liability for your unauthorized involvement. Ryder's jaw tightened. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to prevent 300 funerals. If that creates liability problems for your clients, maybe they should examine why their procedures had no answer for that situation. The room erupted in whispers. Drake gavelled again. Harder this time. Captain Maxwell, this hearing will determine whether charges should be filed against you for interference with flight operations. Director Scott, your suspension will become permanent dismissal unless you can justify your flagrant disregard for established protocols. Does either of you have anything to add before we adjourn for deliberation? Adeline stood slowly. Administrator Drake, I've spent 12 years following every protocol, every procedure, every rule, designed to keep people safe. On November 12th, I learned that sometimes safety requires courage more than compliance. If this board wants to punish that lesson, go ahead. But don't pretend you're serving the public interest. Drake's face flushed. This board serves aviation safety, Director Scott, not individual egos or dramatic gestures. Then serve it, Adeline shot back. Investigate why that hydraulic failure happened. Examine the maintenance records. Ask the hard questions about supply chains and quality control. Because Flight 2847 wasn't saved by procedures. It was saved despite them. And until you acknowledge that gap, you're just protecting the system instead of the people it's supposed to serve. The hearing room fell silent. Drake stared at Adeline, then at Ryder, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold. This hearing is adjourned. The board will deliver its findings within 48 hours. As the room cleared, Ryder turned to Adeline. That could have gone better. Or worse, she replied. At least we said what needed saying. Even if it costs us everything. Adeline managed a tight smile. Especially then. The call came at midnight. Ryder almost didn't answer, but something about the persistence of the ringing made him pick up. Captain Maxwell? The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with an edge of urgency. Speaking. My name is Alec Jennings. I'm a senior engineer at Titan Aerospace Systems. We manufacture hydraulic components for commercial aircraft, including the ones on Flight 2847. I need to meet with you immediately. Ryder sat up, suddenly alert. Why? Because what happened to that aircraft wasn't an accident, and the people responsible are about to make sure you take the fall for exposing their negligence. They met at an all-night diner on the outskirts of Phoenix, the kind of place where nobody asked questions, and the coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Jennings arrived carrying a worn messenger bag, his eyes darting nervously around the empty restaurant. He slipped into the booth across from Ryder and immediately pulled out a tablet. I've been with Titan for 18 years. I've watched quality standards erode, watched cost-cutting measures replace safety protocols, watched documentation get falsified to meet delivery schedules. I kept quiet because I had a family, a mortgage, a career. But after Flight 2847, I can't stay silent anymore. What are you showing me? Ryder asked, looking at the screen. Manufacturing records for the hydraulic system on your flight. See these serial numbers? They don't match the specifications Boeing approved. These are counterfeit components, cheaper materials that test fine under normal conditions but fail under sustained stress. Titan's been using them for 3 years, across multiple aircraft types. Ryder felt ice water run through his veins. How many aircraft? At least 40 in active service. Maybe more. The records are deliberately obscured to avoid oversight. Why are you telling me this? Jennings looked up, his face haggard. Because they're going to crucify you and Director Scott to protect themselves. They've already started the narrative. Reckless pilot, negligent supervisor, dramatic rescue that shouldn't have been necessary if proper procedures were followed. Nobody's asking why the procedures failed. Nobody's examining the real cause. Until now, Ryder said quietly. Until now, Jennings agreed. I'm willing to testify. I have documentation, internal communications, quality control reports that were buried. But I need protection. The moment this goes public, I'm done in this industry. Ryder studied the engineer across from him. Saw the fear, yes, but also the determination. The same quality he'd seen in Adeline when she'd authorized his involvement despite the risks to her own career. There's someone you need to meet, Ryder said, pulling out his phone. 20 minutes later, Adeline arrived. Jennings laid out everything again, this time with more detail, more documentation, more damning evidence of systematic fraud that had put thousands of passengers at risk. This changes everything, Adeline said, her eyes scanning the data. With this evidence, we're not defending our actions anymore. We're prosecuting theirs. It won't be easy, Jennings warned. Titan has connections at every level of the industry. They've survived audits before by burying whistleblowers. Then we make sure this one can't be buried, Ryder said. He looked at Adeline. We need someone with credibility they can't dismiss. Someone the aviation community respects absolutely. Adeline nodded slowly, understanding. We need Captain Landon Pierce. Pierce had been avoiding media attention since the landing, following airline policy, about discussing ongoing investigations. But when Ryder and Adeline showed up at his home with Jennings's evidence, he listened. And when they finished, his response was immediate. When do we testify? The FAA hearing reconvenes in 36 hours, Adeline said. Pierce stood up, his expression grim but determined. Then, we have 36 hours to make sure they can't ignore this. Captain Maxwell saved my life and the lives of my passengers. The least I can do is help him save his career and expose the people who nearly killed us all. As they left Pierce's home, Ryder felt something shift. They weren't just defending themselves anymore. They were going on offense. And with Pierce and Jennings backing them up, they had the ammunition they needed to turn the hearing from an inquisition into an indictment. You ready for this? Adeline asked as they walked to their cars. Ryder thought about Summer, about the life he'd built after leaving the test program, about the choice between safety and truth. Then he thought about 40 aircraft still flying with counterfeit parts, about passengers who didn't know they were at risk. More ready than they are, he replied. The reconvened hearing had a different energy entirely. The gallery was packed, and news cameras lined the back wall. Administrator Drake looked decidedly less comfortable as he called the session to order. Before we proceed with findings, Drake began. I understand. There are additional witnesses requesting to testify. That's correct, Adeline said, standing. We call Captain Landon Pierce. Pierce took the witness table with the calm authority of someone who'd faced worse than bureaucratic intimidation. He was sworn in and began his testimony. On November 12th, I was piloting an aircraft that had lost all hydraulic control. Every procedure I knew said I was going to die along with 300 passengers. Then I heard a voice, someone who understood what I was facing because he'd survived it himself. Captain Maxwell didn't just save my aircraft. He gave me a reason to believe the impossible was survivable. Drake interrupted. Captain Pierce, we acknowledge the successful outcome. The question is whether proper protocols were followed. Proper protocols, Pierce repeated, his voice hardening. Administrator, your proper protocols had no answer for what happened to my aircraft. If Director Scott had followed those protocols, if Captain Maxwell had stayed silent, we'd be investigating a crash site instead of questioning the people who prevented one. Is that really the precedent you want to set? Before Drake could respond, Adeline stood again. We have one more witness. Alec Jennings, senior engineer, At Titan Aerospace Systems. The corporate lawyers in the room suddenly sat up straighter. Scylla Harmon's face went pale. Jennings approached the witness table, his hands shaking slightly but his voice steady as he began to testify. He laid out everything. The counterfeit parts, the falsified documentation, the systematic fraud that had put dozens of aircraft at risk. Flight 2847's hydraulic failure wasn't a fluke, Jennings concluded. It was inevitable, and there are at least 40 more aircraft flying right now with the same compromised components. Captain Maxwell and Director Scott aren't the problem. They're the only reason we're not investigating multiple crashes. The hearing room erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors to file stories. Drake gavelled repeatedly for order, his face flushed. Harmon shot to her feet. This is speculation and hearsay designed to deflect from. It's documentation, Adeline interrupted, holding up the tablet. Manufacturing records, quality control reports, internal communications. All admissible, all verified, all proving that the real scandal isn't how Flight 2847 was saved, but why it needed saving in the first place. Drake looked at his fellow administrators, saw the calculation happening in real time. They could continue trying to prosecute Ryder and Adeline, or they could pivot to addressing the actual safety crisis. This hearing is suspended, Drake announced. The FAA will be launching an immediate investigation into Titan Aerospace Systems and initiating emergency inspections of all affected aircraft. Captain Maxwell, Director Scott, this board apologizes for the misdirected focus of these proceedings. Your actions are hereby recognized as appropriate given the circumstances, and all disciplinary measures are dismissed. The gavel fell. Just like that, it was over. In the hallway afterward, reporters swarmed them with questions. Ryder kept his responses brief, deflecting credit, emphasizing the crew's skill. But Pierce caught his arm before he could escape. "Thank you," Pierce said simply. "For everything." Ryder nodded. "Just doing what needed doing. That's what heroes always say," Pierce replied with a slight smile. Adeline joined them, her security credentials already restored, her position reinstated. Titan's stock just dropped 40%. The CEO resigned, and the FAA is grounding every aircraft with their components until they're replaced. "Good," Ryder said quietly. "That's 40 crashes that won't happen." They walked out together into afternoon sunlight, where Summer waited with Dylan Porter. She ran to her father, and he caught her in a hug that felt like coming home. "Did you win?" she asked. "We told the truth," Ryder replied. "Sometimes that's the same thing." 6 months later. Skyline International Airport, Phoenix. The training center's conference room was filled with pilots, engineers, and safety officials from across the country. At the front, a new program was being unveiled. The Maxwell Protocol, a comprehensive training system for handling catastrophic flight control failures using advanced thrust vectoring techniques. Ryder stood at the podium, uncomfortable with the attention but committed to the mission. Behind him, a screen showed the data from Flight 2847's landing, broken down into teachable moments. "This isn't about me," Ryder said to the assembled crowd. "It's about recognizing that our understanding of what's possible is always evolving. 10 years ago, landing a 777 without hydraulics was considered impossible. Today, it's a technique that can be taught, practiced, and potentially save lives." Adeline sat in the front row, back in her position as flight director with new authority to implement innovative safety protocols. Beside her sat Captain Pierce, now an instructor for the program, teaching commercial pilots the techniques that had saved his life. In the back row, Summer sat with her notebook, sketching the aircraft diagrams her father referenced. She was 13 now, talking about aerospace engineering for college, inspired by a father who'd shown her that heroism wasn't about seeking glory, but about doing what needed doing when nobody else could. After the presentation, a young pilot approached Ryder nervously. "Captain Maxwell, I just want to say, what you did inspired me." Made me remember why I wanted to fly in the first place." Ryder smiled. "Then take that inspiration and be ready. Because the next emergency won't announce itself. It'll just happen. And when it does, someone will need you to be the voice that says impossible is negotiable." As the crowd dispersed, Adeline joined him. Not bad for someone who just wanted to fly passenger routes and stay under the radar. "Yeah, well," Ryder replied. "Turns out the radar finds you whether you want it or not." Any regrets? He thought about the quiet life he'd built, about the careful distance he'd maintained from his past. Then, he thought about 300 people who'd gone home to their families, about 40 aircraft that had been made safe, about a program that would prepare future pilots for the unthinkable. "Not one," he said. That evening, Ryder and Summer stood on their small porch, watching aircraft traverse the desert sky. Each set of lights represented lives, stories, people going somewhere, or coming home. "Dad," Summer said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "When you were up there, talking that pilot through the landing, were you scared?" Ryder considered lying, giving her the hero's answer. Then he remembered Elena's voice. "Honesty. Always." "Terrified," he admitted. "Because I knew if I was wrong, if my technique didn't work, a lot of people would die, including people I cared about who flew that same route. But you did it anyway. Because being scared of failure is natural. Letting that fear stop you from trying is the real failure." Summer nodded, processing this. Then she leaned against him, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sky. Inside, Ryder's phone buzzed with a message from Dylan. "Another airline wants to implement your protocol. They're calling you the architect of impossible solutions." Ryder smiled and pocketed the phone. He wasn't an architect. He was just a pilot who'd learned to listen when machines spoke, who'd remembered that rules serve people rather than the other way around, and who'd chosen to show up when someone needed help. In the end, that was enough. Above them, Coastal Airways 777 passed overhead, its lights blinking steadily against the darkening sky. Somewhere inside, passengers read, slept, or gazed out windows, completely unaware that the techniques keeping them safe had been born from crisis, refined through courage, and shared because one man remembered that legends aren't built on silence. They're built on speaking up when it matters most. And as Ryder Maxwell stood with his daughter under the vast Arizona sky, watching aircraft trace paths through gathering stars, he knew he'd made the right choice. Not just once, 14 years ago when he'd walked away from test flying, but again, on the day he'd picked up the radio and reminded the world that Dark Rider had never really left. He'd just been waiting for someone to need him. And when they had, he'd answered. Just like he always would. 3 years later, National Air and Space Museum, Washington, D.C. The ceremony was smaller than Ryder had expected, more intimate. A select group of aviation professionals, safety officials, and family members gathered in the museum's main hall, surrounded by aircraft that had made history. Above them hung legendary machines. The Wright Flyer, the Spirit of Street Louis, spacecraft that had touched other worlds. And now, in a glass case near the entrance, a detailed model of Coastal Airways Flight 2847, accompanied by a plaque that read, "In recognition of innovation in crisis, courage in uncertainty, and the reminder that human wisdom will always be aviation's most essential instrument." Ryder stood with Summer, who was now 16, and had just been accepted to MIT's aerospace engineering program. She'd grown tall, confident, carrying herself with the same quiet determination her father had always embodied. "They made a pretty big deal out of what you did," she observed, studying the display. "They made a big deal out of what we all did," Ryder corrected. Pierce, Adeline, Jennings, even the passengers who stayed calm when everything went wrong. Adeline approached, now the FAA's deputy administrator for flight standards, her career having taken off in unexpected directions after the hearing. Behind her walked Captain Landon Pierce, who'd become the chief instructor for the Maxwell Protocol, teaching hundreds of pilots the techniques that had saved his life. "Captain Maxwell," a voice called out. A young woman in a pilot's uniform approached, her face bright with nervous energy. "I'm First Officer Lily Daniels. I just wanted to say thank you. I used your technique last month when we had a partial hydraulic failure over the Atlantic. It wasn't as severe as Flight 2847, but knowing the principles, understanding what was possible, it made all the difference." Ryder shook her hand. "You made the difference. The technique is just a tool. You were the one who had the courage to use it." As she walked away, Summer smiled. "You're terrible at taking compliments. I'm excellent at deflecting them," he corrected. The ceremony began. Officials spoke about safety innovations, about the lives saved not just on Flight 2847 but on subsequent flights where pilots had applied the Maxwell Protocol. They announced a new scholarship fund in Elena's name for aspiring aerospace engineers, particularly those who'd lost parents. When Ryder was called to speak, he kept it brief. 3 years ago, I picked up a radio because someone needed help. That's not heroism. That's just being human. What matters isn't that one flight was saved. What matters is that we learned from it, shared that knowledge, and refused to accept that impossible means inevitable. Aviation is safer today, not because of what I did, but because people chose to listen, to learn, and to challenge assumptions." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "My wife used to say that the bravest thing anyone can do is show up when they're needed. So if you take anything from this, take that. Show up. When someone needs help, when the system fails, when everyone else says it can't be done, show up anyway, because that's how impossible becomes possible." The applause was warm but not overwhelming, exactly how Ryder preferred it. Afterward, as they walked through the museum, Summer stopped in front of a display about test pilots, about the early days of experimental aviation when every flight was a leap into the unknown. "Dad," she said quietly, "do you ever miss it? The experimental flying, the edge of possibility stuff." Ryder looked at the old photographs, at younger versions of himself, in flight suits, standing beside aircraft that pushed boundaries. Then he looked at his daughter, brilliant and alive, and about to write her own chapter in aviation history. "Not even a little," he said. "Because the most important thing I ever did wasn't flying experimental aircraft or saving one flight. It was choosing to be here, with you, for all the ordinary moments that matter more than any extraordinary ones." Summer linked her arm through his. "You know I'm going to study flight control systems, right? Probably going to make some breakthrough that makes your technique look like ancient history." "Good," Ryder said with a smile. "Someone should." They walked out into the afternoon sunlight, where Adeline and Pierce were waiting. The four of them, bound together by crisis and courage, by choices made and lives saved. Above them, an aircraft traced a white line across the blue sky, its path straight and true. And somewhere on that flight, passengers read books, watched movies, slept peacefully, completely unaware that the techniques keeping them safe had been born from a single father's refusal to accept impossible as an answer. Dark Ryder had flown his last mission years ago, but the light he'd brought to the darkness continued to guide others home. And that, Ryder knew, was the only legacy that truly mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.